Hi everyone, Aaron Lolito here to introduce another episode of Wild Roof Journal's podcast series. This one is a roundtable discussion that covers some favorites from issue 6, which came out in January. I'm joined once again by my friend and colleague Chris Vogt, as well as two members of the Wild Roof Journal review team, Anna Schechter and Phoebe Phelps. All the pieces we talk about here are available to view on the website at wildroofjournal.com/podcast. In this discussion, we cover Michaela Edelson's Fallen Firs, Olivia Lee Stagner's poem, The Woods Inside, Victoria Hattersley's short story, The Goldfish, Scout Rue's flash fiction, The Sandwich That Luck Bought, and Andrew Martin's poem, I Like the Thought of Being a Lighthouse Keeper. Of course, there's many other excellent selections in issue 6, so please do give that a look if you haven't done that already. These selections weren't exactly intended to be a best-of list from the issue. Rather, the ones that we talk about here offered something we wanted to explore a bit further, or maybe they prompted us with some questions we thought were worth speculating about. So I'd love to continue the conversation. If these pieces sparked some interest in you, and if you have something to add, or maybe even something we missed, you can connect with us on Instagram at Wild Roof Journal. Also, our email is wildroofjournal@gmail.com. Of course, you could find the podcast itself on the apps Amazon Music and iTunes. Thanks for listening, everybody. I appreciate the support, and I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as we did having it. We'll get introduced, and Chris, you're up first.
Hey, my name is Chris Vogt. I teach English at Erie Community College, musician on the weekends. I've spent lockdown with an 81-year-old father and an 88-year-old dog in dog years. So recent issues and themes on my mind in terms of literature are mortality, death, and the gaping maw of annihilation.
Excellent. Anna?
Hi, my name is Anna Schechter, and I am a senior at Sarah Lawrence College. And I have spent lockdown avoiding those very themes that Chris just mentioned. But I have been reading more poetry lately, so that has been exciting.
Nice. I know there's at least one poem we'll get to today. And then Phoebe.
Hi, I'm Phoebe Phelps. Until lockdown, I was living in Spain teaching English, and then I had to come back here for obvious reasons, and working at this journal has made me read more poetry, which is outside of my comfort zone, but I've been enjoying it more than I thought I would. So
Nice. Perhaps we'll even explore that a little bit.
yeah.
And of course, if you listened before, my name is Aaron Lolito. I'm the main editor at Wild Roof Journal. We'll have one essay actually to start, and kind of similar to the last roundtable we did. We'll go around and each offer up a selection and talk a little bit about it, just kind of what we like, why we picked it, why it stood out to us, and throw some ideas around. Nothing too formal. Chris, you can get started, mention your piece and what you thought about it initially.
Sure. So as usual, I waited to the last second because I'm a delinquent, and I decided to talk about my drastic misreading of Fallen Firs by Michaela Edelson. Subtitle is called My Backyard. If you're looking this up, so that'll be the title and then an immediate subtitle. And what I did was I was doing this, as I said, at the last minute. And so I read the first 5 paragraphs. And because it was a little hazy, I didn't see click here to read the full essay. So I assumed I was reading a short kind of prose poem that ended with this line. She's talking about 2 giant fir trees in her backyard They are stately, but they're also protective figures. They kind of represent her interest in nature, her environmental interests. The beginning is just her describing in really luscious detail her backyard, kind of like going from the immediate back wall, and then you can kind of feel the distance, the forced perspective of moving further and further into the backyard, exploring different plants and animals, ending with these two giant trees that were my protectors. They were my protectors is the last line I thought of this prose poem, which meant I interpreted the entire thing only having read those first 5 paragraphs. So what I'd like to talk about is misreading versus reading, because my reading of this as is was pretty profound because it almost had a haiku feel to it. It ended kind of mystically. They were my protectors was left as an open question. Protection from what? Why do those trees in particular represent element? What's going on in this person's life that she needs? Those 2 trees in the distance. So I'm filling in the gaps and I'm kind of appreciating the open-ended nature of the ending. And I'm a sucker for a good open-ended ending in a poem. It's left up open to the reader's interpretation. But in doing this mistake, I realized you can also go way too far with that, because if you progress, the rest of the essay is a very traditional and well-written meditation on our relationship with the environment and how it's reciprocal, right? We have to protect the environment so the environment can protect us. Not reinventing the wheel, but it's elegantly written. It's kind of thoughtful in how well engineered the prose are. And I was a little disappointed by the second 2/3. I felt like the mystery of the prose poem that I read, even though that was clearly not the authorial intent, maybe wasn't quite as, was maybe a little bit more potent than when I read the second 2/3, which were development, again, luscious writing, excellent detail, a good meditation on how we have to protect nature so it protects us. And so that just made me kind of have an open question about my own interpretation style. Because if I see something in one context, I think this is a prose poem that's only 5 paragraphs long. I read it completely differently than if I'd known it was an essay. It's kind of traditional length, well-developed 5 to 10 page think piece. And so that just made me think about my own interpretation style. Since I've been teaching English for 15 years, I suddenly realized, I clearly misread this, and the correct reading left me a little bit wanting, a little bit disappointed. That could be just an expectation problem. So yeah, that was my reaction was misreading it almost made me like it more than the probably intended reading. And that just made me wonder if other people have had similar experiences like that, where you misread something and you find out a more correct interpretation, and then suddenly you're left a little bit wanting. A comparison to another experience I had it was high school or first year of college. All 4 of us have read Prufrock, yeah? Love Song of Geoffrey Prufrock.
Sure, yes.
That's probably a given, but if not, it's one of those poems you have to read, like top 10 most overly taught poems ever. And it's all about loneliness, isolation. I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. Loneliness, isolation, insecurity. And I read that entire poem thinking that was about going out and getting what you want and making your life your own and making sure you take charge to make sure you disturb the universe and make your presence felt. And when I found out the way most people interpreted, again, I was sort of disappointed. And I actually wanted to keep my interpretation. In other words, I preferred to keep my incorrect interpretation of the poem. Consequences be damned. I just wondered if anybody else had a similar experience. Like, is there a right or wrong way to read a poem? And if so, can you claim a wrong interpretation?
Yeah, is that I might be getting my poems mixed up. Is that the Do I Dare Eat a Peach?
Yes. And when I'm reading that line, Do I Dare Eat a Peach, like, this is somebody who's old, they're worried about their teeth falling out. And they're even willing to take a risk then. They're still going out, they're taking chances, they're taking what they want. And apparently it's about the opposite of that. It's about living your entire life not having taken any of those chances and then winding up at the end looking backwards.
Okay, I see. Yeah, that's interesting. I think even just in the sense of this essay, I think you're onto something, because I think the language, and especially at the beginning, it does have a poetic element there. So I think you could kind of make that mistake if it's a mistake, and like you said, almost read it like a prose poem, and it kind of works.
I think she liked the misreading, but I appreciated the mystery of the furs and what they represent. And she explains very clearly what they're. Somewhere later, she uses this line where it's pretty clear what they represent. She says, "When the two towers fell, my two towers still stood." So clearly, these are something that represent consistency. Her family, divorce, troubled household, but here are these two kind of symbols of something consistent in nature that represents that rock in her life. So it's well written, but it's kind of explicit in that you know exactly what the message is by the time you get to the end. And I wondered if anybody else had a similar experience like that, where you almost wished it was more open-ended.
Yeah. Anna or Phoebe, did anything come to mind as far as either in this piece or something in the past that you've misinterpreted, maybe?
Yeah, well, in terms of sort of immediately editing as you start to read something, like kind of just like this natural editing instinct comes out. And I know I do that with songs a lot because I'll mishear the lyric, think my lyric is actually better or catchier, and then I always sing it as my rewrite, and then people will stop me and be like, you know that it's this, not that. And I'm like, yeah, but I just have a little bit more fun when it's this. So I think it's a similar kind of drive to just, I don't know if it's being a writer or something that makes you want to, you want to edit, you have your own idea of what maybe something should be or could be. But then in terms of misreading, I think that's just kind of the most like just basic, totally gonna happen human mistake when we're reading. I mean, something is lost in translation and in communication. And I mean, part of the beauty of writing is trying to communicate. And I mean, a failure to communicate is not a failure of writing. It just is, I don't know. There's definitely something interesting there.
Yeah, and because the interesting thing, the message doesn't change, or like the words in the essay or whatever it is, the song, and they don't change. But the way you receive them, maybe just the context matters in that case. But I nothing like jumps out at me as far as like a poem that I read and like kind of misread at first. But I kind of get the same impulse that maybe I might want something to be a little more open-ended or want something to be a little more mysterious, because I kind of read the mystery in to a lot of things. And so my one example, I guess, the one current novel I'm reading by Don DeLillo, and I guess that's one of the reasons I'm drawn to Don DeLillo, is like his writing is so mysterious. So I just always, you could just read a page and kind of just get drawn in by the language, and even aside from the narrative and the plots and different things like that, it's just dripping with mystery, this sense of like foreboding, or there's a darkness there. And so I do agree that I would kind of maybe read that in when, if you're patient, maybe you get to a point where, okay, maybe it's not as mysterious. Any other thoughts on that one?
Maybe are you, when you taught in Spain, do you also speak foreign languages as well?
Yes, to varying degrees of success, depending on the day. It's.
I was thinking about the idea of something being lost in translation. Like, English teachers like to say, well, with a poem, the interpretation is up to you. It's totally open-ended. But if it's a foreign language, there is a correct interpretation. Like, which way is the bathroom, or is it the men's room or the women's room? There's a correct answer to that question. But there's also this idea that there can be words in one language that aren't easily translatable to another language. Just wondered if you had any, experience with that.
Oh, completely. all the time. When I was teaching in the high schools, I had to basically explain to the kids the concept of curse words because they put different weight on the words. And so they would learn these words in English and think it's okay to say in a classroom. And the teachers are like, yeah, it's just an English word. And I would have to say, like, you couldn't say that in America.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's different, just because you can translate something doesn't mean you can translate the weight of it or what someone else's brain will do with the word.
Yeah, I think I used the word bloody in front of an English person. They were like, "That's pretty close to fucking." I'm like, "What? No, that's bloody ridiculous." Like, whoa, easy, Tiger. Yeah, that's fun cultural comparative stuff.
Yeah, I guess that is kind of a connection. Is that in the sense of the story or an essay, like the person writing has their own connections to what they want to express. So obviously, that's kind of part of the interesting part about this whole thing, and that's why we do it. Is that we kind of maybe shape it to what fits, and if we're not careful, and like you said, if you're reading faster, not paying a lot of attention, we just kind of shape it to what we already know. But yeah, that's a little bit on that one. I mentioned there's probably another piece that we're going to cover that's a little bit of a connection. So I think, Anna, that was one of your selections.
Yeah, so this is a poem called The Woods Inside. And I was drawn to this poem immediately because the first word is because. And that kind of beginning to a poem, if it's and or but or just something that brings you immediately into whatever the situation is with no explanation given. You are just dropped into, well, because I want the woods inside. Like that, like there's something so great and so kind of all encompassing of that. Like when you start that way, I got really excited. And then I kept getting excited with the inversion of inside and outside, and then I was thinking, well, inside what? Inside the body or outside of the body? Then I was thinking inside of a house or outside of a house. And it seems that both seem possible, but as the poem goes on, it seems more of, house versus nature and wanting, the woods to be able to come inside, but obviously not being able to make that happen. And I don't know, I just think there's such an attention to the details, which is very beautiful. And then you've got this image of the grave robber rather than, someone who causes harm. So this is someone who, looks for fallen leaves, things that are already detritus, things that are already decaying rather than, taking anything down in its prime. So there was just something very like peaceful and meditative about this. It made me happy. And it also made me think, yeah, I wish I could bring the woods inside. Or should I just go outside to them? But would it not be the same? Like, is there, do you want the comfort of inside and the comfort of the woods, but you can't have both at once? So I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that line. I want to get to that. I liked it immediately in the first time I read it. Well, I guess maybe the first time I read it this week, after looking back at it again. It just made me stop after I read it. And the line in the third stanza, I will not have the hand of an executioner, only of a grave robber. So
that's good. It's
the one you just gotta like think about for a second. And I think that's one of the questions I wanted to ask is is it a good thing to be a grave robber in this poem? My reading of it, like it seemed like a positive connotation, at least in the poem's context. Is that what you got out of it as well?
Yeah, definitely. Like it's kind of the, humane version and kind of the not really like interfering. Although it is its own interference, but it doesn't seem as heavy-handed as executioner. It's not hunting. I think of that as like the opposite of what's happening here.
Right. So yeah, when it's positioned next to, not necessarily opposite, but next to executioner, right? It is the more preferable thing to be, I suppose. But yeah, as far as if there's a literal meaning of it, yeah, it's tough to, like we were just talking about. It's definitely an open-ended statement. I think there's a lot of different places you can take it, and that would be one good place to go with it, maybe. But yeah, that one made me just stop and think for a second. And then the other thing, that the inside and outside, where you kind of mentioned that inside is inside a house. I was thinking inside the head, like kind of carrying maybe the experience or the imagery, like in a memory or something like that. At least that's what I thought of first.
That was obviously the line where I can imagine the author writing it, and they came up with that stanza in particular. Like, ooh, that feels good. Because when I was reading the poem, I'm like, this is very pleasant, and I enjoyed this very much. And that was the stanza that grabbed me by the throat.
This might be just because of where we are in the current moment. I mean, it clearly is because of that. But the way I read the opening was that the world outside is all inside because it's all in my computer right now.
Yeah,
and that's just my literal experience. Yeah. So it might not be. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Yeah, there's 3 great ways to interpret it. So that's kind of why it's a simple poem on a level, but it does kind of offer those different avenues to get into. So yeah, that's perfect. And that's going back to kind of shaping the text into your own comfort zone. Like that's kind of my first approach, is like always go like conceptual, or go into like the cerebral aspect of it, go into consciousness. So that was, of course, my first reading of it. But yeah, I like those other ideas. And then yeah, the fragments. I think the first 2 stanzas contain those kind of sentence fragments. And Anna, like you mentioned, that was kind of your initial, the initial appeal of the poem. And kind of tend to agree. There's something, you're just kind of placed in the middle of that idea, and it's not too hard to grasp or get a sense of, but they kind of make things a little bit askew, I think.
Do you know when this was written? Out of curiosity, in case it was informed by the quarantine factor.
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know if it's that recent or not. Could be one of those happy accidents, right? So you kind of, or it might be intentional. I really don't know with this one. And I was just going to mention, it is just overall the poem for me. There's something about it that is kind of comforting in a way, even though the content of it is a little bit unsettling. But just the conciseness of it, it's compact. It kind of gets you in and gets you out, and gives you something that is kind of a quite deep meaning, or you can at least take it in a deep interpretation. So I definitely like that about it. Yeah, so I think we'll move on to the next one. Phoebe, looks like you're up. Which piece did you select?
I chose The Sandwich That Luck Bought. I chose this short story because even after I read it, I'm not really quite sure whether we're living in a world, whether it is some sort of speculative work, or if the narrator is just supposed to be kind of crazy. And I think it's fun. And I can't find it. Sorry.
No, you can take a minute. I was looking at it again today, of course, reading it over. And yeah, there's a little bit of, there's like slightly absurdist angle to it. It's not anything too experimental or something that is difficult to grasp, but there's this, slight kind of pleasant absurdity in the narrator's perspective. So that's kind of like something that just the voice of it can have that appealing quality, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I like the idea of constantly wishing on everything just so that you can find a penny. because they talk about luck and like wishes, but they never say what they wish on, and that they want anything big or spectacular or magnificent. They just want like the excitement of finding a penny, which I think is quite sweet.
Right. Yeah. And there's I guess the idea that it's like maybe like practicing it for when you need it or something like that. So in this like world, there's a little bit of the kind of I like the way you put it. It's there's kind of a sweetness there. Like I'm going to need this later, so I need to get my practice in. Yeah, and I guess the end goal in this piece is not something too terribly ambitious. It's just saving enough pennies to buy a sandwich. So there's kind of a nice little kind of circuit that works in this one. You get, and it's a short. It'd probably be considered a flash fiction, and I think you get everything you need out of it, even though it is a short piece.
For me, there was a fork in the road after the first paragraph or stanza, however you want to read it, when he says, after some extensive online research, I discovered most all my earthly problems are caused by a weakened luck muscle. And I was wondering at that fork, he could take it towards full satire, and this could be kind of a look at internet health programs and, juice cleanses and detoxes and health crazes, and workout CrossFit cults and so forth. And I wondered if he was going to use luck as a way to kind of explore that. And I was kind of pleasantly surprised that it seemed less cynical. I was expecting kind of a full, hard-biting satire. And I might say I was a little relieved when it had that kind of that sweetness to it, an innocence and an optimism that I certainly appreciate.
Yes, well put. And the one question I wanted to kind of throw out there with something like this, and not necessarily specifically to this one, because I think, like I mentioned, I think it does what it needs to do in a short amount of space. But sometimes, and I imagine Anna and Phoebe, some of your commentary at times was what I'm about to say, and especially like flash fictions or microfictions, it just doesn't seem developed enough. So it's that kind of question of when is a short piece done, and when is it just kind of not developed enough. And this one I think does get us there. I don't find myself wanting to know more about more about his eyelashes or something like that. It's not an experience I don't think a reader would have with this one. Is there kind of a good way to know when a short piece is actually supposed to be short? As your experience as writers, anything come to mind on that?
Clearly, I'm no good at judging, since I thought the shorter version of the thing that was actually longer was the better version, so I don't trust myself at all anymore.
Well, I think specifically with this short story, it only works for me because it is so short and because it doesn't expand more on the world and give us any scene or any other people. It's just him saying, hey, I've got these pennies, and then it's over. Because then you get to decide for yourself. Like I said at the beginning, you don't really know, is he in this world where there are, like, he doesn't show us the anti-wishes or the demons. He's just talking about them. You just get little snippets of it. And I think for this piece specifically, that's what I like about it. So if he were to expand on it, if he were to go into sort of like what Chris was saying, a more detailed scene of how he found things out on the internet, then it would be sort of too much, and it wouldn't be as short and sweet.
I don't think this works as like the beginning of a Neil Gaiman 400-page novel where he's going to set up the whole mythology. It's kind of in and it's out. That's very nice.
Yeah, and I think there's sort of, as Aaron was saying, this circular or circuit-like shape of it, especially given the title, which I love. Immediately, the title, I'm wondering, is luck a person? Like, what, twist of fate means that a sandwich is lucky? Like, how does that happen? So I was immediately drawn in by that title. And then at the very end, we realize, okay, the luck is that there's another penny in the jar, which is closer to a sandwich. So you've got that full circle moment. And I think that is kind of like 101 foolproof way to finish a piece off. Every single professor tells me, if you don't know how to end, go back to the beginning. And I think, going back to the title and, it was a rewarding moment as a reader, because I'm like, oh, I get the title now. Yes. And then it does also have this sweetness to it, which is also satisfying. And you've got like these neuroses, but they don't have this heavy or satiric or bogged down sort of feel. So that the whole thing ends up being a nice compressed little circuit, as Aaron was saying.
My favorite line, I don't remember the exact wording, but the idea of adults don't always have object permanence, like with a fingernail or a strand of hair. I was like, ooh, that's good.
Yeah, I got it. Even fully grown humans often struggle with object permanence.
Love it.
I know, I do. I definitely do. So yeah, I felt seen.
Yeah, so there are, as light as it is in certain ways, yeah, there is that like a little bit of underneath, the little glimpse underneath the surface, which kind of gives it that a little bit of sense of depth, kind of makes it a little more engaging than if it was just kind of a feel-good piece or something like that. So yeah,
there's a lot of this, but there's not a single reference to fate versus free will or any heavy-handed language of determination, determinism versus your autonomy as a human. But it's flirting with all those pretty heavy philosophical concepts.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's what's kind of neat about it. Actually, it might be good to stick with fiction a little bit. So I think, Anna, your other selection was a longer short story.
Yes. So I selected The Goldfish, which I just selected like on an impulse, because again, I was drawn to the title, and then the very first line with this bloody dead fish just completely caught me. And I was like, okay, I'm going to be on this ride, whatever it is. And then the introduction of second person comes next, which further pulls me in. Like now, not only am I interested, I'm actually like part of it. There's actually stakes. Like I've actually kind of assumed a role in the story. So this story basically follows Laura and Leah, who are English. And basically they have had some sort of falling out, and it's bad blood is there for sure. And it finally ends with a very like simple moment where they do interact again. And it's like, it becomes this, I don't know, the whole thing feels quite heavy, and there's just a lot of inner monologue and overthinking and thinking about the past and thinking about the sleazy guy at the bar and all these things. Like, what's the retort I'm going to say to him? Oh, I could have said that, but I didn't. There's so much of that going on and swirling around. And then you get to this ending that is super light, and it's just like blue eyes and a little like neat little teeth. And there was something very hopeful about that I think I clung on to. And I think the voice was also very fun for me to get immersed in and just feel. There's definitely there's a cynical aspect to the voice. And then there's definitely hurt and loss and wishing things weren't the way they were. Yeah, so I was glad to have picked this, even though I picked it first because I liked the first line.
It feels good to get rewarded for that.
There's a lot of interesting going on with this one. And yeah, just the inner monologue itself, but the second person was just kind of a weird, as a reader reading it even the first time, it does throw you off, or it threw me off, as far as who's talking about who. Like, you don't know who's even talking, and you don't know who they're talking about at first. So that just the reveal of the two main characters that are involved, one is the narrator, and one is the friend who they've had a falling out. The narrator had a falling out with. just those little reveals of the characters seems like quite an accomplishment as a reader when you do get there. Yeah, and it's strange. I don't like off the top of my head, I don't remember too many like short stories that are kind of so involved in a second person. That seems like a difficult task. If you gave that as like as an assignment in a writing class, I feel like that would be that'd be kind of a mean assignment. Write a short story like entirely in second person.
I've seen people attempt it in writing classes I've been in, and there was definitely a level of mastery to this one that I don't think I've seen in some of the courses I've been in. So I was appreciative of it.
This of all the pieces that we were supposed to look at today, this was by far my favorite. And yeah, you're hit on something when you said it's something we've seen done frequently, mediocre fashion. And I felt like I was in confident hands when I was like, well, who is the observer? Who's this narrator? Who's this person watching? And every time I started to get frustrated, like this person is just being vague to be vague because it's mysterious, the author would drop a hint and say, yes, nice tits. Therefore, the person speaking is a female. I needed that. And so they would drop just enough hints so you felt guided along, but there was enough unknown to keep it appropriately mysterious or ambiguous. And there were a couple of killer lines in there. I liked the voyeuristic feel initially, and I kind of appreciate almost imagine somebody with the binoculars across the street looking. And being me, the hopeless romantic, I assumed it was a former lover. Like I guess, of course.
Me too.
I'm going to see the former lover from 15 years ago. And then, as I was wondering, well, is it supposed to be that voyeuristic or this kind of awkward angle? She launches the image of the spider and the cobwebs watching from the top. And I was like, yes, the winner. And that felt good because I felt like I was in confident hands all the way through.
Yeah, I think the sort of ambiguity of Laura, Leah, like even those names sounding a little similar, they do become interchangeable, which I think really tells you a lot about the intensity of the relationship that's been lost, whether romantic or platonic. I don't 100% know, but I can happily read it either way. But there's an intensity in relationship that has been lost and almost a losing part of yourself type of thing.
That's neat. I didn't think of the idea of kind of the duality or how similar they are, but I thought the ending was pretty definitive. Like I felt very confident I understood the ending. The only ambiguity was the line, "No wonder you left." And the response is, "You didn't leave me." Oh, that's the first time where I actually have to do the little mental hiccup. Like who's talking with whom and what did that mean? And so when you get to the punchline, it wasn't about the goldfish. That it makes it all the more effective, I think, when you get to that final closer.
Right. And I was going to mention too with the names, as I was just jotting down my notes when I was reading it, I got that, I first wrote down the narrator as Laura, and then the next one as Lee or Leah, and then I had to cross them out and like reverse it just because the first name you get is actually the other person. The dialogue, there's very few, I think, lines that are like intent or like spoken out loud. There's very few quotation marks. And I think, Anna, you mentioned before, just it's so much of an internal dialogue, you almost feel like it's all the way to the very end. We get just this, the actual spoken dialogue is so minimal, and there's so much buildup inside that it does feel like such a relief, I guess, when you get to that end point. And I mean, I assume we all can relate. I know I can. Just, if you're weighing on, or something's weighing on you, you have something inside for 15 years that was maybe unresolved, or any amount of time. Five days would be a long time to have something kind of swirl around, and you fixate on it, and you wonder what happened, why it happened, all that stuff. So you just get that kind of swirling inner dialogue, and then very nicely the simple closure.
I can guess the answer, but I want to see if I'm right in anticipation of the possible answer. Just thumbs up or thumbs down if you think they get back together. And go. Oh, I'm the pessimist one.
Oh. No, this. I don't know what this says about me. It's some very sad wishful thinking.
I'm sure it's much more sad on my front. but I felt like I was just telegraphed all the way through that, well, this is the comforting goodbye. It'll be very formal, but also deeply felt on both sides, but not enough will be said. And I think the pregnancy was the fact that she had a pregnancy that she was still kind of recovering from physically, which built an entire alternate life that I assumed she couldn't break out of.
Yeah, so visually, three of us put our thumbs down. But I don't know. It's definitely not like for sure. It's just the sense
Right.
that just that fleeting interaction, like it's positive in a way because it's kind of, you do get like a sense of resolution, but I don't think it's, and especially when the narrator's talking about kind of the good times or whatever, the times they had, they're not going to return to that. It's kind of that idea that you kind of look back and you have a fondness for those days, but it's not possible to go back there. So the one line at the beginning I liked that kind of brought me into that was kind of talking about herself as a group in that second person way. A group of you, none of you with jobs, but yet somehow still able to afford endless drinks, talking happy shit that seemed important and not knowing yet what time really meant. So, I mean, going back to that after you read the end, I think that's shed some light maybe on the tone of the interaction, maybe.
Go ahead.
I was going to say the only argument I have in my favor is screw it at the very end. I just think maybe not that there's ever going to be a return to the good old days, but that there's some sort of space open for reconciliation, some space open for there's a little wiggle room there. I think screw it. I was like, oh my gosh, when I got to that line.
That works because it would be the story is her acknowledging and really thinking intelligently about how she was acting in the relationship. So the line where she was apologizing for everything else is her realizing mistakes he made. So that actually does work for a positive reading. And even if it's 50-50, I always find poems or stories like this uplifting in the sense that you're looking at somebody who really cared about somebody else, and all the details bespeak this level of intimacy that a lot of people can fake in the moment. But if you actually internalize it and becomes part of who you are, that's a whole different thing. So just the fact of the existence of a story or a poem like this is optimistic in that somebody really was thoughtful and intimate and close and captured those little details and then recreated them. Like that by itself is just an optimistic thought on top of my pessimistic interpretation.
Right, and it's definitely not. It's not something that's really easy to put your thumb on as far as what happens. So it's there's enough ambiguity to the ending where it makes for a good interpretation session.
Does anybody here know Stuart Dybek, the writer?
I don't think so.
He had a little flash of prominence like in the early 90s. He had like a little peak and then he kind of faded away. But he wrote one short story that all of us writers had a crush on for a long time called Pet Milk, like P-E-T, milk, of the condensed milk. And it's very similar in that it's just a slice of life and it's a little more literal. It's a guy and a girl who are dating already and they meet in a subway after they've eaten some oysters and basically have a little torrid love affair between several stops. And it's the kind of thing all fledgling writers want to write. Like, oh, I've had experiences like this. He clearly does a deep dive into what seems like a pretty mundane love affair situation. He captures all of that nuance and detail. It's like 12 pages long. Like it's a slog to get through. Very good. One of my top 20 favorite stories, but not top 10. I feel like there's a lot more economy here and there's a lot more sensitivity without the kind of anatomical breakdown of what a relationship is, good or bad. So I think this is actually better than that. And that used to be my favorite of that genre.
I was actually going to ask, and I really don't know an answer to this, so maybe a rhetorical question. But I guess between this one and then the one we just read, the flash fiction, and just the use of voice, because both of them have pretty effective narrative voices. How does that happen? Have you done or heard of or experienced like exercises to practice something like that, practice a skill like that as a writer?
I have myself and also had my students try deliberately write the most cliched version of the form. So if you're going to do a second person observer narration, yeah, I might even give them the setup. Imagine you're going to meet an ex-lover and you're standing across the street watching them, but write the most corny, dumb version possible. And sometimes they're hilarious. Sometimes they're actually quite good, just in terms of being laugh out loud funny. But it kind of clears the pipes. You kind of listen for cliches. You listen for what a lot of people overdo. And then sometimes you could subvert that. There's some good TV shows that do this where they listen for the pattern and the rhythm of a typical sitcom and they deliberately invert that. So it doesn't always work, but it's a fun exercise and it's kind of low stakes. Write something as bad as you possibly can based on this form.
I love that.
It's a good exercise.
Any other ideas? Seems like when you read a piece like that, you know it, and when it's not there, you know it. But it's just struck me that I don't really. If I was trying to build that skill in my own writing, I would have trouble doing it, I think.
One thing that I've done a couple of times, I think it's been assigned to me in 2 different writing workshop or class style things, is put a character in a situation that is bizarre or impossible and keep their tone cool. Or put a character in a situation that is as mundane as it gets and have them all the way elevated. So that like really cool voice emerges when there's a mismatch between what should be happening and how someone is responding to an environment. So if someone's at the supermarket and they're absolutely hysterical, like something very interesting and weird can emerge. And I think that is how we can start to get closer to real voices, creating voice that is, has all the just weirdness that an individual has. So I really like that exercise. I put a character inside the tattoo of her ex, and like she's just chilling out. She loves it. It's her home. And that piece actually got published recently. So that was a really good exercise, and it came to actually be something. So, yeah.
Nice. Yeah. So I think maybe the takeaway there is that kind of that level of exaggeration. So if you take just a premise, turn that one dial to the 10 and kind of try to leave everything else the same. And just that exercise of exaggeration. Not that everything's going to work, but you could kind of maybe pull out a couple. Maybe there's a good line in there that you get out of something that you wouldn't ordinarily do. Yeah, and I was going to say with both of these prose pieces, I think that's kind of the key piece as a reader is that you don't feel like you're reading about somebody. You kind of feel like you're in somebody's head. So that was part of the engaging quality of these. Is you don't feel you're just being told about a character, which happens sometimes in a short story form. Any other selections to cover, and we can go from there.
Were we going to consider doing the visual art pieces that I forgot the name of?
Well, the other one, we could at least mention it. That Andrew Martin is interesting in itself because there was a selection of the digital art, and then he had a poem along with it, which not necessarily part of the artwork, but kind of connected in some way. So we'll at least mention that one. I think Phoebe, that must have been your selection, right? The other one from you.
Yes.
What was the appeal of that one?
Well, it's a poem, and I can't speak very eloquently about poetry, and I just liked it, basically. But I think I liked it because there's this wistfulness of romanticizing the past and just like very generic images of being a lighthouse keeper when there were candles and shipwrecks, and then all of a sudden the question is asked, is there a dark housekeeper, like the inversion of lighthouse? And that can mean so many things to me, and to me, because they're talking about the past, it sort of made me think of someone who keeps the past on instead of like the lighthouse on, which might not be like a very close reading, but that was just the general sense that I got from it.
I can step in with an assist and do it. I have not read the poem at all, but lighting towards the future, darkness in the past, that'd be a nice kind of cleaning factor of the rotation. So I think you've got a totally solid pieces there.
Right. And just the overall symbolism of a lighthouse, just the imagery on its standalone, and then kind of building off of it, using it as the initial image, and then building off of it. And kind of, in an interesting way, because you get that reversal from first stanza to second stanza. It skews a little bit towards abstraction, but definitely you get those tangible images that are familiar enough to keep everything grounded. But yeah, you get a couple kind of either odd phrasings or just kind of a little bit to keep you on your toes. And then that more rhetorical question, again, to kind of keep it a little more into the abstract, going a little bit deeper.
What drew me in about this poem is the fact that there's only one punctuation mark, and it's a question mark, and everything else is, ongoing. And then there's like this question, and somehow the question becomes a definitive thing almost, because it's the only thing that's ended by punctuation. But I don't know, that just signaled an importance. And I do like the idea of the inverse of the dark house.
Yeah, I didn't even make a note that there was no other punctuation other than the question mark, because normally that would annoy me. I mean, I remember giving this comment to different feedback situations in poetry, and maybe I'm sound like too much of a stickler, but it's like, use punctuation. When poetry just doesn't use any punctuation normally, it's kind of a turnoff for me. So it speaks to this one that that's exactly what's happening, and I didn't even notice it, let alone get distracted by it.
I think something to do with the rhythm of each line. Like, they just kind of are like boop, 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 that I felt like I didn't need punctuation to just continue reading. And then I hit that question mark and I was like, oh my God, there hasn't been any punctuation. The world's spinning out of control. Like it. So I think, I don't know, there was something I really latched on to that question mark for sure. And I didn't feel a lack of there not being other punctuation marks.
Right. I'll use this piece as an example of a benefit of social media, because I connected with Andrew on Instagram before he submitted. So I'm assuming that's where he got familiar with us. So these days we have to take the positives where we can get them with social media. So kind of expanding people's artwork and making connections in that area, and we can chalk that one up. But yeah, that's a good point on that one for sure. So we'll wrap things up here. Excellent selections, everybody. And then we will probably be back at some point with some more of these roundtable discussions. I was going to start calling them round screen discussions, but I decided to double back and just do the traditional roundtable. Everybody knows what that is. But if that phrase ever catches off in the future, you heard it here first, even though I may not officially use it. But
once this is online, it's copyrighted. So if somebody after the fact that you publish this, you probably 100% have a copyright claim.
I hope that's the way copyright works, because that would save me a lot of headaches if I'm protected by just posting something online. So yeah, it's the idea going forward is we'll do some more of these and kind of do more of the interpretive exercises, which are fun in themselves, but hopefully it's more of an interactive experience with listeners out there who can read these pieces or view them and have their own ideas, and hopefully are enlightened a little bit by what we have to say. So thanks for joining me, everybody, and we'll talk to you again later.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.